Jasper Collins had always understood the beauty of being overlooked. There was comfort in the quiet rhythm of his days, an assurance in the solitude that wrapped around him like a well-worn coat. Every morning, before the world had fully stirred, Jasper would pad across the creaking wooden floors of his small house. The faint light of dawn slipped through the windows, soft and hesitant, as if it too was reluctant to intrude. He moved with deliberate ease, brewing a pot of strong coffee whose rich aroma filled the air. Grounding him, this ritual, small and unremarkable, was his anchor reminder of the peace he had come to rely on in his later years. The house itself, perched on the edge of a modest town, bore the marks of a life lived simply. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a roof that groaned during storms might have drawn pity from strangers. But to Jasper, every imperfection was a memory. This was the house where he and Lillian had built their life. It was where they had raised their children, now scattered across the country. It was where laughter had once echoed in every corner and where silence now reigned, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator or the creak of the rocking chair. Jasper didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he welcomed it. He had long made peace with the idea that life moved forward with or without him. At 68, he had no illusions about being remembered for greatness, and he didn't want that kind of attention. He had his work at the hardware store, a steady job that allowed him to fix things for people who still valued practicality over convenience. In the store, Jasper was the man who knew where to find the right screws for an old window frame or the best way to patch a leaky pipe. He was patient with customers, offering advice without judgment, especially to the younger ones who sometimes fumbled over questions about tasks they didn't yet understand. His hardened hands, worn smooth in places by decades of labor, carried a quiet authority. But outside of the store, Jasper became invisible again, and he preferred it that way. He wasn't trying to avoid people. Exactly, it was more that he didn't see the need to impose himself. If life had taught him anything, it was that most people carried burdens they didn't speak of, and some of those burdens came from assumptions too ingrained to be noticed. There were moments, though, when the weight of those assumptions pressed heavier on him. Like when a customer's eyes lingered just a beat too long on his dark skin before asking if he was the manager or the janitor. Or when a colleague at the store, meaning well but missing the mark, called him one of the good ones. Jasper had learned to let these things pass. Not because they didn't matter, but because he couldn't afford to carry them all. It wasn't bitterness that kept him quiet. Jasper had known anger in his younger years, but time had worn it down to something softer, a resignation, perhaps, or a wisdom that there were battles worth fighting and others that weren't. And yet, beneath his composed exterior, there was a quiet question he carried. How much of himself had he given away in the name of peace? On evenings when the hardware store emptied and the streets grew still, Jasper would take the long way home. His neighborhood, with its aging houses and untamed gardens, was no different from him, weathered but resilient. As the setting sun painted the horizon in hues of gold and amber, Jasper's mind often wandered. He thought of his children, imagined their laughter filling rooms he no longer visited. He thought of Lillian, her presence still lingering in the house they had shared, her voice an echo in his quieter moments. But this evening felt different. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that came before a storm. Though the sky was clear, the sounds of the neighborhood were muted, as if the world itself had paused. Jasper, ever attuned to the subtle changes around him, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. And as he turned the corner onto Pine Street, his steps slowed. Ahead, near the old church with its crumbling steeple, a car swerved sharply. Its tires screeched against the pavement, a jarring sound that cut through the stillness. Time seemed to stretch as the vehicle veered off the road, crashing into a lamppost with a force that made Jasper's breath catch. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Then, as if some invisible force had nudged him forward, Jasper began to run. The soles of his shoes slapped against the pavement, his heart pounding with a mix of urgency and fear. When he reached the wreckage, smoke was billowing from under the hood. Through the shattered windshield, he could see her, a small, elderly woman, slumped against the steering wheel. Her face, pale and lined with age, was a mask of pain and confusion. Jasper didn't hesitate. He gripped the door handle, his calloused hands pulling with a strength that surprised even him. The metal groaned, stubborn and unyielding, but Jasper wasn't about to give up. "Hold on, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "I'm going to get you out of here." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but filled with fear. She murmured something he couldn't quite hear, her words faint and fragmented. But Jasper understood enough. She needed help, and he was the only one there to give it. As he worked to free her, the world seemed to shrink to this single moment. The sounds of distant sirens, the flicker of streetlights, the cool night air all faded into the background. It was just Jasper and the task before him. An ordinary man thrust into an extraordinary moment. And though he didn't know it yet, this moment would ripple outward, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. Jasper Collins had never thought of himself as a hero. Heroes were the people who wore uniforms or stood on stages, who were noticed and remembered. Jasper didn't belong in that category, and he was fine with it. His life was quiet, unassuming, and predictable until the night it wasn't. The car's crash had shattered more than just glass and metal. It had fractured the calm of Pine Street, sending ripples of alarm through the still night air. Jasper, breathless from running, stood before the wreckage, his pulse pounding in his ears. Smoke coiled from the engine, and the acrid scent of burnt rubber stung his nose. Inside the crumpled vehicle, an elderly woman slumped against the steering wheel, her fragile frame dwarfed by the chaos around her. For a moment, he hesitated, not because he was afraid though he was, but because he wasn't sure what to do. A lifetime of keeping to himself had not prepared Jasper for this. Yet as he saw the woman's face, pale and etched with pain, instinct took over. "Ma'am," he called, his voice steady but soft. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes flickered open, unfocused and glassy. She didn't respond, but her faint movements were enough to propel Jasper into action. The car door was stuck, the handle stubborn against his tugging. His hands, calloused from years of labor, gripped it tighter. The metal groaned under his weight but refused to give. Behind him, the quiet of the neighborhood remained unbroken. No one else had come. It wasn't surprising this part of town wasn't known for its bustling streets or attentive passersby. Jasper was alone, as he often was, but this time, solitude felt heavier. He planted his feet firmly, braced himself, and pulled again. The door gave way with a sharp crack, swinging open just enough for Jasper to reach inside. The woman stirred, her breath shallow and uneven. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I've got you." Carefully, he unbuckled her seatbelt, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. She was light, her body frail beneath his touch. Lifting her felt like lifting a memory, something delicate and fleeting, something that required more care than strength. He carried her to his own car, parked a few feet away, and laid her gently in the back seat. The sirens were still distant, their wail faint against the hum of the night. Jasper glanced at her in the rearview mirror as he started the engine. She was trying to speak, her voice a whisper barely audible over the rumble of the car. "Eleanor," she managed, her words fractured but determined. "Eleanor Weston." Jasper nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "We'll get you taken care of, Miss Eleanor. Just hold on." Her next words were harder to piece together. Fragments of an apology mixed with disjointed explanations. Something about a wrong turn. About confusion. Jasper's heart tightened. She sounded more embarrassed than frightened. As if her greatest concern was being a bother. "No trouble at all," he said gently, though his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than he intended. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and hurried voices. Nurses descended upon the car as soon as he pulled up, whisking Eleanor away with a flurry of medical jargon. Jasper stayed behind, standing awkwardly by the curb. His work was done, or so he thought. But he didn't leave. Something about the way her eyes had looked clouded with fear, searching for reassurance, anchored him to the spot. He waited in the sterile hum of the waiting room, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the floor. Hours passed. Jasper wasn't sure how long. Time felt irrelevant here, swallowed by the quiet urgency of the hospital. He thought of his wife, Lillian, and how many nights they'd spent in waiting rooms like this. Back when her health had begun to fail. The smell of antiseptic brought those memories rushing back. Sharp and unrelenting. Finally, a doctor approached. His expression was calm, professional, but Jasper could see the weariness beneath it. "She's stable," the doctor said, his voice low. "You got her here just in time." Jasper nodded, a quiet relief washing over him. He didn't ask for details, he didn't need them. Knowing she was safe was enough. As he stepped out into the night, the cool air met him like an old friend. The streets were empty now. The commotion of the evening reduced to a memory. Jasper began the walk home. His thoughts heavy yet clear. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. At least, that's what he told himself. But as he moved through the stillness, a quiet unease settled over him. Would anyone else have stopped? Would anyone else have seen the value in saving a life that, to some, might seem easily overlooked? Jasper didn't know the answers. But he couldn't shake the questions. They followed him home, lingering in the shadows of his modest house. And as he brewed his morning coffee the next day, the aroma rich and familiar, he realized that something within him had shifted. It wasn't just the act of helping Eleanor. It was the reminder of how fragile life was and how easily people could slip through the cracks, unnoticed, unless someone chose to see them. For Jasper, it was a lesson he hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. Life, he thought, was full of quiet moments like these, moments that seemed small but carried the weight of something much larger. And in those moments, even a man who preferred to go unnoticed could find himself at the center of something significant. Jasper Collins had hoped life would settle back into its familiar rhythm after that night. He woke the next morning expecting the same creaking floors beneath his feet, the same steady drip of the leaky faucet in the kitchen, and the same quiet solitude he had grown to accept, if not entirely cherish. But something felt different. As he walked to the hardware store that morning, the usual nods from neighbors seemed longer, their eyes lingering just a bit too long. Some offered faint smiles, while others seemed on the verge of saying something but stopped themselves. Jasper didn't ask. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. At work, the younger employees whispered in the aisles, their eyes flicking toward him when they thought he wasn't looking. One of them, a teenager with shaggy blonde hair, finally approached, fidgeting with the zipper of his hoodie. "Hey, Mr. Collins," he said, his voice unsteady. "I heard you, saved that lady last night. That's really cool." Jasper shrugged, his tone even. "Just did what anyone would have done." The boy nodded, but the awe in his expression didn't fade. Jasper turned back to stocking shelves, feeling the weight of the attention settle over him. It wasn't pride he felt, it was something closer to discomfort. Like a shirt that didn't fit quite right. By the time he returned home that evening, Jasper was exhausted in a way he couldn't explain. The day had been no different from any other in its tasks. But the way people had looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time, left him feeling exposed. He had just set his keys on the worn kitchen table when a knock echoed through the house. Jasper frowned. Visitors were rare in his life. When he opened the door, a man stood on the porch. He was tall and neatly dressed, his suit crisp and his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the fading light. Everything about him spoke of professionalism, from the firm set of his jaw to the briefcase in his hand. "Mr. Collins?" the man asked, his voice calm but deliberate. "That's me," Jasper replied cautiously. "I'm Daniel Weston," the man said, extending a hand. "Eleanor Weston is my mother." Jasper hesitated before shaking his hand. There was a quiet intensity in Daniel's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something harder to place, an emotion that felt too layered to name. "She told me what you did for her," Daniel continued. "I came to thank you personally." Jasper shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to praise, especially not from someone like Daniel, someone who carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never questioned whether he belonged in any room. "It was nothing," Jasper said, his voice steady but low. "Just glad she's all right." Daniel shook his head. "It wasn't nothing to her. Or to me." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Jasper. Confused, Jasper opened it and froze. Inside was a check, more money than he had ever seen in his life. "This is for you," Daniel said. To repay you for what you did. Jasper's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of taking money for helping someone didn't sit right with him. He started to hand the envelope back. But Daniel raised a hand to stop him. Please, Daniel said, his voice softening. This isn't just about what you did. It's about what it meant. My mother, she's all I have left. If you hadn't been there. His words trailed off, but the unspoken sentiment hung heavily in the air. Jasper hesitated, searching Daniel's face. The gratitude was genuine, but there was something else, something unspoken, yet deeply felt. Reluctantly, Jasper nodded and tucked the envelope into his pocket. Thank you, he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. As Daniel turned to leave, he paused on the porch, his hand resting on the railing. You know, he said, his tone quieter now, she called you her guardian angel. Funny, isn't it, how the world works? Jasper didn't reply, and Daniel didn't wait for one. He walked down the steps and disappeared into the twilight, leaving Jasper alone with his thoughts. Back inside, Jasper set the envelope on the table and stared at it for a long time. The money could fix the roof, repaint the house, maybe even replace the aging appliances that rattled and hummed with every use. It could change a lot. But as he sat there, his mind drifted to the way Daniel had looked at him, not just with gratitude, but with curiosity, as if he were trying to reconcile the image of a quiet, middle-aged black man with the role of a savior. It wasn't the first time Jasper had felt the weight of unspoken questions. The subtle assumptions that came with his skin, his age, his place in the world. In the store, customers sometimes glanced at him twice, as if surprised that someone like him could offer expert advice. On the street, strangers sometimes crossed to the other side, their eyes flickering with polite unease. And now, even in this moment of recognition, there was a quiet tension beneath the surface, a reminder that kindness didn't erase the invisible lines people drew in their minds. Jasper sighed, the sound heavy in the stillness of the room. He wasn't angry. He had let go of anger long ago, knowing it burned too hot to carry for a lifetime. But the questions lingered, unanswered and unasked. The envelope remained on the table as Jasper turned off the lights and prepared for bed. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars faint but steady, and as Jasper lay in the dark, he couldn't help but wonder if the lines people drew could ever truly fade or if they would always linger. Faint but present, like shadows in the starlight. The envelope sat on Jasper's kitchen table for 3 days. Untouched. He had moved it once, tucking it beneath an old stack of newspapers, as though hiding it would lessen its weight. But the knowledge of its presence lingered, pressing against his mind with the same quiet insistence as the drip of the leaky faucet. It wasn't just the money that unsettled him. It was what the money represented, a debt that Jasper didn't believe existed. He hadn't saved Eleanor Weston for a reward. He hadn't thought about anything, really, except that she needed help. And yet, the check on his table seemed to suggest something more complicated, that what he had done was extraordinary. Unexpected. On the 4th day, Jasper finally picked up the envelope again. He unfolded the check and stared at the numbers, still grappling with their enormity. He thought of his house, the way the rain seeped through the roof on stormy nights, and the peeling paint on the porch railings that Lillian had once loved to lean against. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what could change. The following weekend, Jasper found himself at the hardware store not as an employee, but as a customer. He bought supplies he'd been putting off for years, fresh paint, sturdy new shingles, and the tools to tame the garden that had long since surrendered to wildflowers and ivy. At first, he worked alone. The rhythm of repair was familiar, comforting even. The scrape of a paintbrush against weathered wood, the steady hammering of nails into a new roof. It was a language Jasper understood, one that didn't require words or explanations. But as the house began to transform, so too did the neighborhood's attention. A few days into his project, Mrs. Chapman from next door wandered over, holding a plate of cookies she claimed to have baked that morning. Jasper doubted her story. The cookies were far too perfect, with their neat little rows of chocolate chips, but he didn't say so. She lingered longer than usual, asking questions about the house and remarking on how nice it would look when it was done. By the end of the week, More neighbors stopped by. Mr. Greer from 2 houses down brought over his ladder when he noticed Jasper's was too short for the higher parts of the roof. The Robinson kids, twins no older than 10, showed up one afternoon with brushes in hand, eager to help with the painting. Jasper hadn't expected any of it. For years, he had lived among these people with little more than polite nods exchanged on the street. Now, they seemed drawn to him, as if the changes to his house had somehow made him more visible. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. One afternoon, as he worked on clearing the overgrown garden, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He looked up to see Eleanor Weston walking slowly toward him, her cane tapping softly against the sidewalk. She moved carefully, her frailty more apparent now, but her smile was steady. "I thought I'd stop by and see the place for myself," she said, her voice warm. Jasper wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to meet her. "Good to see you out and about, Miss Eleanor," he said. She glanced at the house, taking in the fresh paint and the tidy roof. "It looks wonderful," she said. "You've done good work here." Jasper nodded, unsure how to respond. Compliments never sat easily with him. Eleanor settled onto the porch steps, her hands resting on her cane. She looked at him with a kind of quiet curiosity, as though trying to unravel something about him that she hadn't yet understood. "Do you know what my son told me?" she said after a moment. "He said he didn't expect someone like you to be the one to help me." Jasper stiffened slightly. He didn't ask what she meant, he didn't need to. He didn't mean anything by it. She added quickly, sensing his discomfort. "But it stayed with me. You know? Made me wonder about the things we don't even realize we're carrying around." Jasper didn't reply. He focused on the dirt beneath his hands, pulling at the stubborn roots of an overgrown weed. "You remind me of my husband," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. "He was a quiet man, too, always helping people, but never wanting the fuss that came with it." Jasper glanced at her, surprised by the comparison. He didn't feel like a man worth comparing to anyone's husband, let alone someone who had clearly been so loved. Eleanor stayed a while longer, talking about her family and the life she had built before it was upended by age and illness. Jasper listened, offering the occasional nod or hum of agreement. He didn't say much, it wasn't his way, but Eleanor didn't seem to mind. By the time she left, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the street. Jasper watched her disappear down the sidewalk. Her slow, steady steps a reminder of how fragile and resilient people could be all at once. That night, as he sat on his newly repaired porch, Jasper thought about what Eleanor had said. About the things people carried, their assumptions, their biases, their quiet fears. He thought about how easily those things could shape the way people saw each other, often without anyone realizing it. And he wondered, not for the first time, if those quiet lines could ever be erased, or if they would always be there, faint but persistent, like the shadows cast by the porch light. For now, though, Jasper focused on what he could change. The house, the garden, the small corners of his life where his hands could make a difference. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, Jasper thought, something was enough. The garden was the last piece to reclaim. Jasper Collins stood among the tangled mess of wildflowers and ivy, a rusted spade in one hand and a bucket in the other. The house, now with its fresh coat of paint and its newly shingled roof, stood behind him like a quiet promise of something better. But the garden, Lillian's garden, was a different matter altogether. For years, he'd let it grow wild. At first, it had seemed too painful to touch, as if every weed that crept in was a marker of her absence. Later, it became easier to leave it be, to let nature take over. But now, as he knelt among the overgrown roots, Jasper found himself wondering if there was still life beneath all that chaos, waiting to bloom again. He was halfway through clearing a patch near the fence when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You're doing her proud, you know." Jasper turned to see Eleanor Weston standing at the gate, her cane leaning against her leg as she clasped a small potted plant in her hands. She had insisted on walking the few blocks from her home, even though Jasper had offered to come to her instead. She liked the walk. She said it gave her time to think. "Thought this might be a good addition," she continued, holding up the plant. It was a lavender bush. Small but vibrant. Its purple blooms fragrant even from where Jasper stood. He took the plant from her carefully, nodding his thanks. Lillian always loved lavender, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the memory. Eleanor smiled, settling herself on the porch steps. It's hard, isn't it? Bringing something back to life when it's been left alone for so long. Jasper didn't answer right away. He crouched back down, his hands moving through the soil with a deliberate care. It takes time, he said finally. Eleanor watched him work, her gaze thoughtful. It's like that with people too, she said. Takes time to untangle things. To figure out what's worth keeping and what you can let go of. Her words lingered in the air, settling into the spaces between them. Jasper had always appreciated Eleanor's way of speaking, not too heavy, not too light, but with a kind of quiet truth that felt earned. As the afternoon stretched on, more neighbors drifted by. The Robinson twins brought over lemonade, their mother standing a few feet behind them with a tentative wave. Mrs. Chapman offered Jasper a pair of gardening gloves she claimed were brand new, though they bore the unmistakable signs of use. Even Mr. Greer showed up, though he mostly stood in the shade, nodding approvingly as Jasper worked. The attention still unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it. For years, Jasper had lived as a man apart, not entirely removed from the world, but not fully part of it either. Now, it seemed as though the small act of repairing his home had drawn people closer, their curiosity mingling with something else, something more complicated. Not all the interactions were easy. One evening, as Jasper was packing up his tools, a man he didn't recognize stopped by. He was younger, dressed in a pressed shirt and slacks, with a clipboard tucked under one arm. Mr. Collins, the man said, his tone polite but brisk. I'm with the Neighborhood Improvement Committee. We've noticed the work you've been doing, and I wanted to talk to you about some guidelines for maintaining aesthetic standards. Jasper straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't reply right away, letting the man's words hang in the air. The man cleared his throat, glancing at the freshly painted house and the half-cleared garden. It's great to see the effort you're putting in, he added quickly. We just want to make sure everything aligns with the neighborhood's character. Jasper nodded slowly, though the words settled uneasily in his chest. He knew what the man was saying, even if he didn't say it outright. After the man left, Jasper sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He thought about the unspoken lines that still lingered, the way people sometimes struggled to reconcile their admiration with their assumptions. Eleanor joined him later, bringing 2 cups of tea. She didn't ask about the man or what he'd said, but Jasper suspected she already knew. They'll catch up, she said after a while, her voice soft but firm. People like him, they don't mean harm. They just don't know how to see things any other way. Jasper sipped his tea, the warmth of it settling into his chest. Maybe, he said. The days turned into weeks, and the garden slowly began to take shape. The lavender bush Eleanor had brought found its place near the front, its blooms standing tall against the freshly turned soil. Jasper added more plants, some chosen for their practicality, others simply because they reminded him of Lillian. The neighbors continued to stop by, their conversations growing longer, their visits more frequent. Jasper still wasn't sure how to feel about it all, but he didn't turn them away. One evening, as he stood in the garden, wiping the dirt from his hands, Eleanor joined him again. She looked at the garden, at the house, at the neighbors chatting by the fence, and smiled. You've built something beautiful here, she said. Jasper glanced around, taking it all in, the laughter of the Robinson twins, the smell of lavender on the breeze, the way the setting sun cast a warm glow over everything. Didn't do it alone, he said. Eleanor nodded, her smile deepening. That's the best kind of work, isn't it? The kind you don't have to do alone. As the stars began to appear, Jasper stood there a little longer, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sense of belonging. Not just to a place, but to the people around him. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, something new could grow in the spaces left behind. Jasper Collins wasn't a man who sought recognition. He had spent most of his life in the background, observing rather than participating, and that suited him just fine. Yet, as the weeks passed, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in how the world around him seemed to regard his presence. Neighbors who had once offered little more than a passing nod now lingered by his garden, asking questions about the flowers or offering unsolicited advice on pruning techniques. The children on the block no longer hesitated to wave at him, their bright smiles a stark contrast to the wary glances he'd grown accustomed to from their parents. It was a strange feeling, this newfound visibility. Jasper wasn't sure if it was the fresh paint on his house or the story of Eleanor Weston that had spread quietly through the neighborhood. Either way, people saw him now, and they seemed determined to pull him into their fold. But not all attention felt welcome. At the hardware store, the whispers grew louder. Customers who had never given Jasper more than a second glance now offered hesitant smiles, their curiosity poorly disguised. Some of the regulars asked about Eleanor, their questions laced with a mix of genuine interest and something less innocent, something that felt like the need to reconcile their assumptions with the man they thought they knew. "Didn't know you had it in you," one customer said, clapping Jasper on the back as if they were old friends. The comment was meant as a compliment, but it settled uneasily in Jasper's chest. What exactly did they think he had in him? Jasper didn't dwell on the question for long. He'd learned long ago that people often didn't realize the weight of their words, the way they revealed more about themselves than they intended. Still, the undercurrent of their remarks stayed with him, fretting through his days like a quiet hum. It wasn't anger he felt, not entirely. It was more like a deep, abiding weariness, the kind that came from knowing that some battles were too deeply rooted to be won in a single lifetime. One evening, as he was finishing up in the garden, Eleanor stopped by. She had a basket of freshly baked muffins, though Jasper suspected they were more store-bought than homemade. She sat with him on the porch, the two of them watching the last light of day fade into the horizon. "They're talking about you, you know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Jasper raised an eyebrow, though he wasn't surprised. "What are they saying?" Eleanor smiled faintly, her hands resting on the cane she always carried. "Depends on who you ask. Some say you're a hero. Others think you've got some kind of hidden agenda." Jasper let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Agenda? What kind of agenda could I possibly have? You'd be surprised what people come up with when they don't know how to make sense of something," Eleanor replied, her tone matter of fact. Jasper didn't respond. Instead, he looked out at the street, where the faint glow of porch lights illuminated the quiet houses. "They'll get over it," Eleanor said after a moment. "People always do, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it." Jasper glanced at her, her words settling somewhere deep inside him. He knew she was right, but knowing didn't make it any easier. In the days that followed, Jasper noticed something else, a quieter, more profound ripple effect. It wasn't in the whispers at the store or the curious glances from his neighbors. It was in the small acts of kindness that began to unfold around him. Mr. Greer, who rarely spoke to anyone, started helping the Robinson kids with their bikes, adjusting their handlebars and tightening their chains. Mrs. Chapman organized a bake sale for a family down the street who had fallen on hard times. Even the man from the neighborhood committee stopped by with a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden, his earlier criticism replaced with a sheepish attempt at goodwill. Jasper watched it all with a quiet sense of wonder. He didn't believe for a second that he had caused these changes, but he couldn't deny that something had shifted. One afternoon, as he walked home from the store, a woman he didn't recognize stopped him on the street. She was younger, with tired eyes and a hesitant smile, and she held the hand of a small boy who clung to her side. "Mr. Collins?" she asked, her voice tentative. "That's me," Jasper said. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for what you did for Mrs. Weston. It means a lot." Jasper nodded, unsure how to respond. The woman hesitated, then added, "My son's been asking about you. He wants to know how to help people like you do." The boy looked up at Jasper with wide, curious eyes, and for a moment, Jasper didn't know what to say. "You tell him it starts with seeing people," Jasper said finally. "Really seeing them?" The woman smiled, her expression softening, and she nodded before walking away. That night, as Jasper sat on his porch, he thought about the boy's question. He thought about how small acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. And he thought about Eleanor's words, the reminder that he didn't have to carry the weight of others' expectations or assumptions. Jasper didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't think of himself as a man who had changed the world. But as he looked out at the street, at the glow of porch lights and the quiet hum of a neighborhood that felt just a little more connected, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest change came from the smallest moments, from the quiet, steady act of simply being there. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For most of his life, Jasper Collins had understood his place in the world. It was a quiet, solitary place, marked by routine and the kind of careful distance that kept things uncomplicated. But now, as the neighborhood seemed to shift around him, he couldn't help but feel the edges of that solitude begin to blur. He still walked home from the hardware store each evening, taking the long way through the familiar streets. The difference now was that people waved when they saw him. Some stopped to chat, their words filled with a warmth that felt both new and tentative. Jasper listened more than he spoke, nodding at their stories and observations. But he couldn't shake the sense that beneath their friendliness lay something else, something harder to name. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jasper was stopped by a man he recognized but didn't know well. Mr. Turner, a retired accountant with a reputation for keeping to himself, stood by his gate, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Jasper," Turner said, his voice hesitant. "Got a minute?" Jasper slowed, nodding. "Sure, Mr. Turner. What's on your mind?" Turner gestured toward his yard, where an old oak tree leaned precariously toward the house. "Storm last week took its toll on that tree. I'd cut it myself, but my back." He trailed off, his discomfort evident. Jasper looked at the tree, then back at Turner. "I'll bring my saw by tomorrow," he said simply. Turner's shoulders sagged with relief. But there was something else in his expression, something like surprise. "Appreciate it," he said. The interaction stayed with Jasper as he continued his walk. It wasn't the request itself that lingered, it was the way Turner had looked at him. As if asking for help had been a leap of faith. The next day, as Jasper worked on the tree, a few neighbors wandered over to watch. Some offered advice, others brought tools they thought might help. By the time the job was done, Turner's yard looked like a community project, and Jasper found himself standing at the center of it all. Later, as he packed up his tools, Turner approached him. "Don't know why I waited so long to ask for help," he said, his voice low. "Guess I just didn't think." He stopped, his words hanging unfinished. Jasper didn't press him to continue. He understood what Turner wasn't saying. It wasn't the first time Jasper had sensed that hesitation in others. That quiet internal struggle between old habits and new realizations. People were trying, he could see that, but their efforts carried an undercurrent of guilt, a reckoning with the subtle ways they had kept their distance from him without ever meaning to. Eleanor Weston had touched on it once. During one of her visits, she'd been sitting on Jasper's porch, sipping tea, when she said, "You know, people are funny about change. They want things to be better, but they don't want to admit what wasn't right to begin with." Jasper had nodded, her words striking a chord he didn't often speak about. He had lived with those quiet barriers his whole life, the ones that weren't spoken of but were always there, shaping the way people moved around him. And yet, he couldn't deny that something was changing now. The neighbors who had once kept their distance were beginning to close the gap. They invited him to cookouts and neighborhood meetings, asked his opinion on things that had nothing to do with gardening or repairs. At first, Jasper wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent so long on the periphery that stepping into the fold felt unnatural, almost intrusive. But little by little, he let himself lean into it. He accepted their invitations, even if he didn't always stay long. He offered advice on their projects, sometimes lending a hand when they asked. And though it felt strange at times, he began to see the value in those connections, not just for them, but for himself. One Sunday afternoon, the Robinson twins invited him to their lemonade stand. Jasper sat in a folding chair, sipping the overly sweet drink as the kids chattered excitedly about their sales. Mrs. Chapman passed by, stopping to chat about the bake sale she was planning. Mr. Greer offered Jasper a newspaper, pointing out an article he thought might interest him. It was a small moment, unremarkable in many ways, but as Jasper looked around at the faces gathered there, he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. The barriers weren't gone, not completely. There were still moments when he caught a flicker of hesitation in someone's eyes or sensed the weight of unspoken questions. But those moments were becoming fewer, their presence overshadowed by something stronger, a genuine effort to see him. Not as a quiet figure in the background, but as part of the fabric of their lives. As the day stretched into evening, Jasper walked home with a quiet sense of gratitude. Change, he realized, wasn't something that happened all at once. It was slow, deliberate, and often messy, but it was happening, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be part of it. That night, as he sat on his porch, the stars faint above him, Jasper thought about the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been one he'd chosen, but it was one he'd embraced. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for: connection. Not just to others, but to himself. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges. There would still be moments of discomfort, misunderstandings, and the quiet shadows of assumptions that would take years to fade. But as Jasper sat there, listening to the hum of the night, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, he thought, the act of embracing change was its own kind of victory. The morning began like any other. The wooden floors of Jasper Collins' house creaked under his steps, the sunlight filtering through the kitchen window in quiet streams. The coffee pot burbled softly, its familiar rhythm grounding him in the stillness of the day. Yet something felt different, though Jasper couldn't quite name it. The house, once worn and tired, now stood as a reflection of renewal. The fresh paint gleamed faintly in the morning light, the repaired roof strong and unyielding against the elements. The garden, once overrun, had blossomed into a vibrant array of colors, a testament to patience and care. Jasper could see the lavender bush Eleanor had brought him swaying gently in the breeze, its purple blooms a reminder of her quiet encouragement. He sat on the porch with his coffee, the neighborhood beginning to stir around him. A child's laughter floated from the Robinsons' yard, mingling with the faint hum of a lawnmower down the street. For years, Jasper had existed on the edges of this place, content in his solitude, but now, the edges had softened, the invisible lines that once separated him from others slowly fading. As he sipped his coffee, Jasper thought back to the journey that had brought him here, not just to this porch, but to this moment of quiet connection. It wasn't a path he had chosen deliberately, but one that had unfolded through a series of small, unexpected acts. It had started with Eleanor Weston. Jasper hadn't set out to be a hero that night, he had simply done what he thought anyone would do. But the ripples of that moment had spread in ways he couldn't have anticipated, touching lives in quiet, unspoken ways. He thought of Eleanor now, her cane tapping softly against the sidewalk as she visited his garden. Her words laced with the kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime of seeing the world for what it was and what it could be. She had taught him something important, that change, though difficult, was possible, even in the face of long-standing barriers. Jasper's gaze drifted to the street, where neighbors were beginning to gather. Mrs. Chapman waved as she carried a tray of cookies toward the Robinsons' lemonade stand. Mr. Greer leaned against his fence, chatting with Mr. Turner, their conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. It wasn't a perfect picture. Jasper knew the lines of division didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when he felt the weight of others' assumptions, the quiet hesitations that reminded him of how deeply ingrained those barriers could be. But he also saw the effort, small, imperfect, but genuine, of people trying to bridge the gaps between them. The knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Daniel Weston stood there, his suit crisp as always, a familiar envelope in his hand. "I wasn't sure you'd be home," Daniel said, his tone lighter than it had been during their first meeting. "Where else would I be?" Jasper replied with a small smile, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then extended the envelope. "My mother wanted me to bring this to you," he said. "She calls it her thank you for the garden fund." Jasper took the envelope but didn't open it. He didn't need to. The gesture was enough. You know, she talks about you all the time. Daniel added. Says you've become a fixture in her life. Like a brother she didn't know she needed. Jasper chuckled softly. She's been good to me too, he said. As Daniel left, Jasper placed the envelope on the table and returned to the porch. The sun had climbed higher now, its warmth spreading across the street. He watched as neighbors came and went, their movements fluid and unhurried. It struck him then how much had changed not just around him, but within him. For so long, Jasper had been content to live in the background, to let the world move forward without him. But now, he saw the value in being part of it, in allowing himself to be seen and known. The changes weren't dramatic. They weren't the kind of things that made headlines or drew attention from the wider world. But they were real, and in their quiet way, they mattered. Jasper finished his coffee, setting the empty cup on the porch railing. The lavender swayed in the breeze, its fragrance carrying on the air. He breathed it in, a quiet smile spreading across his face. He didn't know what the future held. There would be challenges, of that he was certain. But there would also be moments like this, simple, unremarkable, but filled with the quiet joy of connection. And in the end, that was enough. Jasper stood, stretching as he prepared to join the neighbors gathering down the street. The journey wasn't over, not for him, not for them, but as he stepped off the porch and into the warm embrace of the day, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, the greatest legacy a person could leave was the quiet, steady reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing the world one moment at a time.